Since 1980, he has endeavored to disseminate forgive me, the Spiritist doctrine in the United States, and the newsletter he started with a few idealists celebrates now 27 years of uninterrupted publication. Excuse me. For 20 years, Professor Zerio has organized the schedule and has translated for Divaldo Franco in the US, Canada, and Europe. He'll talk to us about the context and impact of Kardec's 1862 journey and the Spirit's book. Professor Zerio, please.
Allan Kardec's 1862 missionary journey and the Spirit's book. A mission, an assignment by an organization to a group or an individual to establish a religious organization in a new land. A missionary, the person in charge of this responsibility. The mission of Allan Kardec was defined many years, was defined and designed many years before his birth on earth. And we owe this information first to Francisco Xavier, a medium, a Christian, somebody who defined his mission as being a letter carrier for the spirits. Somebody who embodied the highest level of Christ consciousness among the people of the last century. We owe this other side of the mission to his major partner in the process, Emmanuel, spiritual guide. Emmanuel was the guide that brought the news, brought the ideas, brought the wisdom. Emmanuel, a true ambassador of Christ. Ambassador of Christ because was a man with a superior intelligence. A man with a great level of wisdom, but also a spirit who brought with him many incarnations in the pursuit or in the service of Christ. But he also brought us a historian's perspective. And it is in his word, in the book we know as A Caminho da Luz, on the pathway of light, that he describes a moment in the life of France in which the spirit world, the highest circles of spirituality, concerned with the destiny of France, concerned with the future of the Latin people, comes together. And this group of individuals, this group of spirits, illuminated, committed, inspired by Christ, among them, the one day we knew on earth as Joan of Arc. They plead to Christ for a new guidance. And the spirit is invited, is encouraged to accept a task on earth. The spirit we came to know as Hippolyte Léon Denisard Rivail. Before we enter in our discussion, I have a little spiritual trivia. We are now in the midst of elections in the United States. Now, I'd like you to raise your hand. What was the political orientation of Mr. Rivail? Was he a liberal or conservative? Was he a liberal or conservative? Please raise your hand, those of you who think Rivail was conservative. There is no neutrality. Either you are liberal or you are conservative. Kardec was conservative. Raise your hands. 30%. Kardec was a liberal. 60%. There are 10% who have now participated. Second question. Mr. Revival voted for the first time when he was 18 years old, 21 years old, 26 years old, over 40 years of age. 18 years old, raise your hand. 5 people. 21 years old, raise your hand. 10 people. 26 years old. What the rest? 40 years old. Goodness, the majority. We will be talking about 1862. 1862 is a divider of the waters from the perspective of our presentation. But before we get to 1862, we need to understand what preceded this moment so that we can understand what followed this moment. And when we think about this, we have to remember the Arc of Triomphe was ordered by Napoleon in 1806 and was delivered in 1836. Very important part of French history. But as we think about Kardec, and we think about the man who came later to be known as Kardec, Hippolyte Léon Denisard Rivail. He was born in 1804. What was the world then? What world he faced? What situations his family faced? What shaped his view of the world? What I'd like to do is to think about the worldview, or the creation of the worldview of the man we know as Mr. Revival. The worldview, according to Freud, is this mental construct, is this mental architecture that we have that provide us with answers about the most fundamental questions of life. Who am I? Why I live in the world? Why do I relate to others? How I choose the relations? It is shaped by culture, it's shaped by life, but we all, individuals, have worldviews. Now the question is, what creates the worldview of Allan Kardec? Because fundamentally from the spirit world, it is not enough to throw Kardec on earth and expect things to happen. There must be a plan. And there must be a planning of his life and his learning and his views, so that at the proper time, his worldview would allow him to see the things he needed to see in the phenomenon, to understand what he needed to understand, and to extract the inferences that needed to be extracted. The worldview of Kardec starts with France suffering. Kardec is born in 1803. He is born into a country that is profoundly traumatized. A country that is bleeding, that country that is suffering. And if we go back to 1789, French Revolution, his parents were 15 to 16 years old at the time. His parents were part of a very painful process in the history of France. And Kardec is born to a country that's traumatized by the French Revolution. France was a country with 3 classes, the 3 states. The first state, the first and highest level of political hierarchy were the clergy. The second state were the aristocrats, the kings, the noble families, and the third state, all others. The first 2 accounted for 3% of the French population and control 70% of the land and 70% of the economic power of the country. The revolution to bring equality is successful, but it loses its aim. And in losing its aim, It accomplishes one thing. It passes the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Great accomplishment in the history of France. But after this, Robespierre becomes a fan of the guillotine. And that's where the French Revolution loses its direction. And here we have Mr. King preparing for the end of his life. Fascinating part of this process is that the hatred, the commotion, the fear of the Republicans, the fears of those who promoted the revolution, led to the point of the only way we can prevent the opposition coming back is by cutting off their heads. And it starts with the king. It starts next to it his wife, Marie Antoinette. But it is spread throughout the political system. Everyone was against the reforms. Everyone was against the system. Everyone who dared to raise his voice. And they lost over 30,000 people to the guillotine. Very interesting is that a very old, terrible concept comes back with this. After the king, they show the head. It becomes a very terrible symbol of the revolution. The guillotine and showing the head. This is not going to bother us anymore. They had the three major elements of the political system, as I said. The clergy, number one. The aristocrats, number two. The rest of the population, number three. The aristocrats never paid taxes. The clergy never paid taxes. The people paid all the taxes. The people financed the government. On the shoulders of the people, France operated, the French economy operated. The formation of Allan Kardec's or Mr. Revile's worldview is a very interesting phenomenon that we have to remember. We have to understand. The spirit world did not just throw Allan Kardec into the world, prepared a very detailed plan. And he had to reincarnate in a family that was very open-minded and was willing to accept new ideas. The creator or the leader of the new ideas was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the intellectual brain behind the revolution. He was not involved in the revolution, but he was the intellectual brain of the revolution. One part of his life is really important. He was the highest regard theoretician of education, and he proposed two things. He proposed that man is by nature good. And the second thing is that the purpose of education is to educate the virtues and the character of the individual. And he was hated by the church. It destroyed the concept of original sin, was anti-dogma, was anti-religion, and guess what? He was persecuted. But Rousseau planted this idea of a new concept of education. And the spirit world found a way of placing Mr. Revile on the stream that would bring him to preparing himself for this new reality. And Pestalozzi is the follower and the implementer of Rousseau's ideas. Rousseau presented the framework but never presented the method. Pestalozzi comes to develop the method. One thing in Rousseau is interesting. He proposes that education should be based on books, based on development of virtues, but it should be by mentoring. A mentor should breed, develop the potential of the individual, the talents of the individual, of the student, of the pupil. Pestalozzi comes and develops the methodology. Pestalozzi is in Switzerland, in Yverdon-les-Bains. The parents of Allan Kardec, born in 1803, in 1813, decide that he had two options. Either we educate our little son in France, therefore we have to educate him with the Catholics, because the best schools still were run by the Catholic, or we send him to Switzerland, and they decide to send him to Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi becomes the implementer of Rousseau's ideas, and Kardec is one of the students. Students from all over the world, from the rich, from the best placed families, were sent to Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi creates the institute. Allan Kardec studies with Pestalozzi until he's 20 years old. From 20 to 24, he becomes an assistant to Pestalozzi. The mentoring process continues. First in the classroom, second after the classroom. 1827, the institute, with the death of Pestalozzi, closes. Kardec returns to France. All of you know well the Spirit's book. All of you have a good sense of the basis of the Spiritist doctrine. And we are talking about the worldview of an individual. Please follow me in exploring the thinking of Pestalozzi to see how the mentoring process was so powerful in the life of Allan Kardec. This is the thinking of Pestalozzi. There is an intelligent will. This will moves the universe and gives life to nature. And I call it God. Think about the resonance, the parallels. Second, Pestalozzi's idea. After that, humans live on an immaterial world. Existence after that depends on their conduct in life in this world. Pestalozzi. Religiousness should be evident in people's day-to-day actions and should bring about moral behavior and acts of love. We are constructing the worldview of Allan Kardec, and Pestalozzi is mentoring Allan Kardec. He was not aware of his mission, but he was being prepared for his mission. A few more. The best religion, I love this, is the one which is the most divine in its inner nature. In its inner nature, while being the least possibly ritualistic in its form. Does it sound familiar? He considered Jesus the divinely perfect man. He uses the word man, the historical Jesus, in whom the divinity generally possible in a human has come to perfection. Jesus was Pestalozzi's model and redeemer through his example and his teachings. He is the mentor of Allan Kardec. People are not guilty of original sin. Rejected the Protestant dogma that faith is enough to redeem a person. And when we think about this concept of creating a worldview of an individual is centered on his education, as we see in the case of Allan Kardec, but the realities of their lives. France was in pain. France was bleeding. France was in the tremendous pressures. The revolution, if we think, the revolution, the effort to give power back to the people against the clergy and for a constitutional monarchy. It has its successes and has its failures. But France lived in poverty, very stark poverty. The poverty in the fields was tremendous. France was unfortunate. They had a string of very bad harvests, and they had a string of very bad winters. And this created poor production of wheat grain. The French do not live without bread. And the landowners and the government, instead of thinking about the needs of the people, allow the landowners to do profit maximization, raise the price of wheat because there was a scarcity. The profits go up, the death rates also go up. The famines, France faced famines. People were dying of hunger. Oppressive labor conditions, tremendous problem in France. The beginning of the industrialization, people had to work very long hours. It was an abusive system. And I show you some of the elements that characterize life in the mining community in the northwest of France. Steel was the gold of the Industrial Revolution. France had a lot of steel, great reserves in the northwest of the country. The mining industry develops, and is a really rough work. Men and women worked 14 to 16 hours a day. They were obligated to work 7 days a week for 3 francs a day. Barely they could eat. If they got into an accident, tough luck. If there was a death in the family, the woman would be a widow without any network of support. These were very terrible times when, composed with the lack of wheat, created very difficult conditions. And what we had? Strikes. What we had? Conflicts with the government. We had demonstrations. And at this time, in power was the Second Empire, and it was Napoleon III, the nephew of Mr. Napoleon Bonaparte. He ascends to power under the promise of democracy. 2 years later, in 1851, a coup d'etat. And the coup d'etat leads to a very strong hand in the handling of any reaction to the government, any confrontation with the government. And the army was on the streets to handle the problems. With instructions to solve the problem at any cost. And the cost usually was human life. This was France. This was France during the period 1848, 1862, 1867, 1871. This is how it was a very strong hand government, very centralized, very totalitarian government, ran with very, very tight hand by Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon III. Something that you have to remember also that's very important, 2 things more, epidemics. Very terrible problem in France. In 1848, a major cholera epidemic. And it spreads, and over 100,000 people die in Paris for one reason. Primarily, they did not know the origin of cholera and did not know the process of transmission. In the suburbs, in the banlieue of France, people lived in agglomeration, and that was rapid fire for the cholera. Cholera destroys the suburbs of France. The rich, the bourgeoisie, leaves. The poor stay, and the poor die. So these were very traumatic times, and Allan Kardec is living through this. He's a member of the Parisian Society. He is living and making a living first as a teacher, first as an owner of a school, later as a bookkeeping economist. On the other hand, we think about the other side of France. Napoleonic Wars. France lost hundreds of thousands of able-bodied men. People died in wars, and the men left the society. Crimean Wars, during the Restoration, people lost. The grain crisis you have all these years of crisis, and I'll relate this to our next point in my presentation. And at the end, we have the Second Empire. Just a few interesting notes. The Second Empire with Napoleon III was supported by, guess who? The clergy. And by the aristocrats. They came back to power. And Napoleon was such a nice guy, such a lovely man, that in retribution for the support received by the church, he passes a law where primary and secondary education will be supported, will be run by the Catholics, and will be supported by the government. And in the federal budget of France, 10 million francs, a huge amount of money, was allocated to build schools, churches, and monasteries. The French government paid a salary to the clergy. At that time, in 1862, there were, and this was a 400% growth over 5 years ago, 52,000 priests, 13,000 friars, amazing, 84,000 nuns, all receiving salary from the state. However, they ran the schools. We should not only look at one side, but the purpose of running the school was a way of establishing a very solid relationship with Mr. Napoleon. Now, those of you who love history, one more interesting thing. In the French Senate, the Cardinal of France had a permanent seat, had a life seat. In the Senate of France, a member of the clergy had a permanent seat. And this was the environment at the time. That's what creates the worldview of Allan Kardec, is the ideas, the education, plus all the events that shaped his life. And this is France, and Kardec is a proud Frenchman. However, in order for this to happen, the spirit planners, and what I described is this process of planning the incarnation of Mr. Revile. Is from the moment the ideas and the process were conceived in the spirit world to the point where at one day he saw the mediumistic phenomenon and said, this is it. His worldview had prepared him to see what was right to see. The spiritual planners engaged over 100 of the best minds of the century to ensure that three momentous ideas were in alignment. Very critical. Allan Kardec could not have done it by himself. The two ideas that were very critical. Number one, the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. The theory is published in 1859. Very, very important to remember this. The second one was Camille Flammarion. Camille Flammarion, the date you see there is 1856. Remember this. This is the peak of their career. That's the high point of their career. And these were the triangle that was necessary and was planned by the spirit world so that the ideas could take root in the French society. Two more things were critical at the time. The most beautiful book, if I had one book to read in my whole life, I would read every day until I die. The Life of Christ by Ernest Renan, one of the greatest genius of the French, And the next one, Les Miserables, Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo was the greatest, most popular name in France. Interesting point, Victor Hugo believed in psychic communication. Alfred Russel Wallace believed in psychic communication. Camille Flammarion believed in psychic communication and practiced with Kardec. Besides, they had beautiful, great reputation and great standing in society. Charles Darwin, Alfred Wallace, The Evolution of Man. So in essence, we are not created to the likeness of God. And we did not come from Adam and Eve. And we are just one element of a very complex process of life on earth. And it attacked the most critical dogmas of the Orthodox religion at the time. This was one of the pieces that had to be in place. People needed to understand where they came from, who they are on earth, why they are on earth. And these ideas had to be diffused through society to help the Spirit's book to take root. The other piece, perhaps as important, is Camille Flammarion. I said that 1859 defined the theory of evolution. Camille Flammarion is even more impressive. Camille Flammarion, at the age of 20 years, publishes the book that defines his standing for the rest of his life in France. And he is recognized as the greatest astronomer of France. And Camille Flammarion is known today as the father of the concept of extraterrestrial civilization. And those of you who watched Carl Sagan and loved Carl Sagan, a lot of his great ideas were first coined, came to mind, came into the intuition of Camille Flammarion. Why Camille Flammarion was amazing? He was 20 years of age. Since he was 14, he had one dream: to teach people to gaze at the sky. He wanted people to look at the sky and to fall in love with Sirius, to fall in love with the Great Dipper, to fall in love with Orion, to fall in love with the comets, to fall in love with the planets, to appreciate the changes in colors. Camille Flammarion lived his life traveling throughout France, educating the schools, educating the children, educating society about the universe. He was the founder of Société Astronomique de France. He launched the book, The Plurality of the Inhabited Worlds. From this comes this recognition. Camille Flammarion would say that only by falling in love with the night sky, falling in love with the stars, staring at the infinite, dreaming with the infinite, raising his head, man would find out who he really is. Only by looking at the sky, man would develop, would devise, would understand their real essence. That was the idea of Camille Flammarion. And I'll show you a video that, in my mind, captures the intuition, this tremendous mental power that Camille Flammarion had, that helped him visualize the universe without the tools we have today. This is a video connected with the Hubble telescope. And for me, is Camille Flammarion, 150 years later, his creation of his vision of the universe expressed with the tools we have today. The greatest astronomer, the father of extraterrestrial civilizations. And this engraving is the Camille Flammarion engraving, developed by him, associated with his name forever. It shows a man that reached the place where the earth and the sky meet. It was at the frontispiece of his first book.
The universe is a big place. We know it instinctively. It resonates on a deep level. We also hear about how big it is every time we go into a planetarium, take an astronomy course, or whenever we just look up at the sky on a clear night. But knowing something is big and being able to visualize it are two different things. When astronomers talk about the size of our universe, they love to use gigantic numbers to explain everything. To astronomers and cosmologists who work with this stuff every day, it makes perfect sense. To them. For the rest of us, though, These numbers are so big, we just end up with a blank stare on our face when we hear them. The problem is, they're just too big to be meaningful, and the study of astronomy is filled with numbers like these. So we go about our daily lives, driving to work, cooking dinner, posting our videos to YouTube, and it's all too easy to forget about the rest of the universe. It's too easy to become caught up in our everyday stuff. After all, we have much better things to do than think about how big the universe is. Let's not be too hard on ourselves, though. I mean, of course the universe matters. It's just that the numbers in astronomy are too darn big to get our heads around. Our brains just aren't wired to visualize big numbers like 47 billion. That's the size of the universe, 47 billion light years in radius. Saying that number, though, doesn't really help, does it? Luckily, an image was taken that can help us see just how big that number is at a glance. In 1995, the Hubble Space Telescope stared, for 10 days, at a rather unremarkable patch of sky. The results were nothing less than humbling on a universal scale. Thousands of galaxies filled the image. Roughly 3,000 galaxies were detected in a patch of sky that looks completely and utterly empty. Let's take a minute and put this in perspective. We live on a planet, one of 8 in our solar system. We'll miss you, Pluto. These planets orbit a rather unremarkable star. Our star is in a galaxy, one of 500,000 million in the Milky Way. I know, big numbers again, but bear with me. This is the Pinwheel Galaxy in the constellation Ursa Major, a galaxy much like our own. This is the largest and most detailed image of a spiral galaxy ever taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. Every one of these points of light is a star. Every single one. Some are bigger and some are smaller than our sun, but they're all stars. Many of them have planets orbiting around them. Looking at this image, the idea that the Earth may be the only planet in the entire universe that harbors life appears almost absurd. It seems much more likely that there are many more planets like ours. Our galaxy is just one of many in our local group, and there are many, many galaxies. When we look up at the sky, we can see only about 3,000 stars on a clear, dark night. From that, it's easy to think that that's all there is. The universe almost doesn't seem quite so big. Now we know better. The Hubble Deep Field is one of the few examples that help us get our heads around just how big our universe is. The story's not over, though. Later, in September 2003, the Hubble did it again. This time, it looked at another unremarkable section of sky and stared at it again for a little over 11 days. They used improved detectors with different filters, and this time, they saw this. This is called the Ultra Deep Field. It represents the farthest we've ever seen into the universe. Over 10,000 galaxies are in this picture. Every single dot, smudge, and smear is an entire galaxy. And each one of these dots has millions and millions of stars. Each star has the possibility of planets orbiting it, each one with the possibility of a civilization. This is what we see when we stare at a blank spot in the sky where nothing appears to be. This is the number of galaxies in nothing. This is a picture of 47 billion light years. It's a picture of how small we are. It is the single most important image ever taken by humanity.
Darwin, Man on Earth. Camille Flammarion, Man in the Universe. The Spirit's book, the essence of the intelligent essence of life in eternity. These were the triangles necessary for the mission to be accomplished. And that brings us to 1862. Kardec leaves Paris because he realized that he needed to communicate with people. The ideas would not travel to the lower level. They would stay at the level of the leaders of the movement if he had not a personal contact with people. He traveled France, and I wondered, how did he do this? And I came to the realization, I thought it was a very complicated process, but I basically traveled by train between major cities, by horse, drawn carriages between secondary cities, and by some other means in the more secondary cities. What is fascinating, in 1860, this is the railroad system of France. And you notice that if I impose the points, he did everything by train, except two cities. Two cities he did by horse-drawn carriage. The cities were Sens and Mehens. But if we look in 1850, it was the railroad system in France. And look how limited it was. In 10 years, the infrastructure was in place for Kardec to travel through France. And as we think about how he traveled, this was one of his taxis. This for domestic. This is for Paris. This is the transportation in Paris. And imagine every morning he had to go to work. Every morning he had to go to a meeting. Every day he had to go to a meeting. He had to travel in one of these little trains. And this was a rail car. A rail car of the Chemin de Fer du Nord. The Northern Railways. And this was the fancy ones. People traveled inside. People traveled outside. And just for you to get a little sense, this was how Kardec traveled in Paris. This was the little bus. People traveled inside, people traveled outside, people traveled on top. The guy sitting there in the back is the guy collecting the fares, two horses. And since you guys thought that Kardec had a great life, remember that in Paris there were 80,000 horses in urban transportation in 1862. Imagine the odor in the morning when Kardec got up to go to work. When he go to a Spiritist meeting. Is this 5 minutes or 1 minute? He had to go to a Spiritist meeting. Imagine the odor. Horse carriage serves as bus, personal transport. And this is a cartoon of the time. Traveling in one of these units during the winter, you become a popsicle. And the French are making fun of the public transportation system. What was the France that Allan Kardec experienced? This is the France. Original photos of the time. In 1851, the flower market in Paris. Paris, in 1856, a view from the Notre Dame, from the area of where the Notre Dame church stands. The Paris Farmer's Gate, that's where the produce entered Paris, through the walls. They had walls and they had the gates. And this was the entrance. 1863, the Nadar balloon, one of the first experiments with the hot air balloons. Bordeaux, 1860, that's what Kardec saw. This was a photo of the time. It's amazing. Bordeaux, the Grand Théâtre, 1860. Port of Marseille, 1850. Map of Lyon, where he was born, 1856. This is a little bit of what he saw and how he traveled. But there was a more important thing related to 1862. I'd like you to notice this. This is a map of the revolution, the strife, the hunger, the confrontations with the government in 1860. Interference with corn movements, pillaging, riots, disorder, and unrest. This is what was going on in France at the time. And if we superimpose the itinerary of Kardec, he went right into the heart of the most distressed regions of France. And he was speaking to people without a job, with miners who had suffered accidents, people making a very, very, very minor living. Life was very hard, and Kardec was speaking to them. What was the political orientation of Mr. Kardec? Liberal. He had to be liberal. The conservative, 2 more minutes. The conservative were Christians, Orthodox Christians. They were loyalists, loyal to the regime. And the last one, past looking, they looked back to the past. Liberals, they were Republicans, they loved democracy. They were anti-church, and they were idealists. He voted only when he was 40 years of age, for the first time. The levels of Spiritism diffusion, remember one thing, Spiritism spread very quickly for one political reason. Either you are conservative with the church, you are liberal and against the church. When you went against the church, you don't go to church anymore? Spiritism brought the answer. Most of the first followers of Spiritism were liberal and against the monarchy, against the empire. The purpose of the journey, in the interest of time, to reinforce the bonds of trust with local leaders. But one more important thing, Kardec was the major defender of feminism. Kardec made, and the Spiritism made, a major effort to raise the profile of women. At a time where the conservatives, the empire, wanted to maintain the women in their position, the traditional position. And finally, if I were a real psychic, and if I were to communicate with Allan Kardec and feel what he feels, I would say that at the end of his life, in looking back, in retrospect for his life, he would come to us at this meeting tonight and would say words like this to motivate you, fellows, friends, workers of the Spiritist doctrine. We accomplish in our lifetime, only a fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is another way of saying that the kingdom always lies beyond us. Friends, servants of Christ, we plant the seeds that one day will grow. We water the seeds that are already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay today the foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects far beyond our capabilities. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders. We are ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future not our own.